Hello there, everyone. A very good afternoon to you all, and thank you so much for joining us today as part of this online CLPL session supported by the Scottish Power Foundation. My name is Conor Ellis. I'm the Learning and Engagement Manager here at Dynamic Earth Science and Discovery Centre in Edinburgh, and I have the wonderful task of welcoming you all here to the session this afternoon and to help introduce the fantastic team that we have here today to deliver the session with you. We've got about 100 people joining us on this call today from across the length and breadth of Scotland. We've got teachers from Edinburgh, Glasgow, Aberdeen, the Highlands, East Lothian, Falkirk, Ayrshire, Pethick and Ross, and Orkney as well. So hello to Stromness and Patdale Primary Schools as well. It's wonderful to welcome you all here today, and I hope this session gives you lots of new ideas, knowledge, and things to try out with your learners. Small bit of housekeeping before we get started today. We are recording this session to share it with other people who might not be able to join today. And you'll also be able to ask questions and interact with the presenters by using the chat function that you have as well. Now, on to the team that's going to be delivering today. We're delighted to be welcomed today by Professor David Reay, who will be handing on to you in just a second, from the University of Edinburgh. Dave is a climate change specialist and science communication expert, so we're really, really delighted that he's giving us his time today. Dave, thank you so much for joining us. And I'm also really delighted to welcome to the team today as well, Chris, Eve and Lauren from Dynamic Earth, who are my fantastic team here, and they're going to be telling you all about how we deliver climate change and learning for sustainability sessions here at the centre. Before we do that, I've just got a little bit of time to tell you a little bit about Dynamic Earth, who we are and what we do. We are Edinburgh's Science Centre. We're the only centre of our kind anywhere in the UK dedicated to earth and environmental sciences and the story of planet Earth. Our vision is to be the generation that creates a positive future for us and our planet, and our mission is to empower people with understanding and empathy for planet Earth. We do this in lots of different ways, some of which you'll be familiar with if you've been to our exhibition before. But we also have a planetarium and a dedicated schools programme of more than 30 indoor and also a whole host of outdoor learning experiences as well. We've even got online opportunities to engage with schools that are slightly further away from the centre who might find coming to us slightly more challenging. We have a fully curriculum-linked programme of experiences covering every earth and environmental sciences topic you can think of. Dynamic Earth Online is our online platform of ready-made resources that are really quick, simple, easy and effective for you to use in your classroom. And we also have some free teacher online CLPL. So the journey with us doesn't stop today. You can also join in with our online e-modules, which we've sent you some information about with your boxes, if those are something that you signed up to as part of the session as well. I hope you have a really fantastic afternoon with us. I'm going to be quiet now and hand you over to the experts, starting off with Professor David Reay. Dave, over to you.
Thank you so much, Conor. And before I start, I should apologise in advance because I'm at home with COVID, like a lot of us have been or are at the moment. So if I kind of fade halfway through the session, you know why. But hopefully the enthusiasm from Conor and I guess all of your enthusiasm is going to hopefully make this a really good hour or so. What I'm going to do is try and condense the whole of, I guess, where we are with climate change into about 20 minutes. So I'm going to fail at that, but I'm going to try my best. And hopefully you'll bear with me when I try and share some slides just to help me with that. So let me just find how I do that again. And any minute now. Conor, can you confirm you can see that all right?
Yeah, you're all good, Dave. We can see that.
Wonderful. Okay, so yeah. So I'm going to talk about climate change in a nutshell because of the 20 minutes, we've got plenty of time to hear more on climate change, how hopefully you can embed it in terms of what you're doing and the context of what's going on in Scotland, in the UK and in the world. So again, an apology because I've got a couple of graphs in here, but these are really dear to my heart. And this is the first one. This is called the Kegging Curve, which is also my Twitter handle, and it's basically how much carbon dioxide there is in our atmosphere around the world. And hopefully what you can see on here is a red wavy line and then a black line underneath that. The red wavy line is each month how much carbon dioxide there is in our atmosphere, and you can see it goes up and down, and that's a kind of beautiful thing to me at least, because that is the oceans and the plants on land taking up carbon dioxide, and because most of that is in the northern hemisphere, certainly the land. You get this kind of seasonal wavy line, which is quite beautiful. It would be more beautiful if it didn't have the black line underneath it. So that's what's happening in terms of the averaging over the years. And we've got this record going back to the 1960s, which shows that every year it returns to a higher concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And carbon dioxide is the most important of the man-made greenhouse gases. The more we have in the atmosphere, the more warming we get. And so that's the kind of the real kicker to this is that trend is still going upwards. And it's dear to my heart because I check it out every month and the URL is there at the bottom, and it's a really geeky thing. I am a carbon geek. But this is where we will see the proof of the pudding in terms of climate action. So where we stabilize carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, when that black line levels off, that will determine if we've succeeded in terms of the Paris Climate Agreement and limiting climate change to something which is manageable, or if we failed. So the time we've got to stabilize that black line is really running out. The other thing I always do is I get far too optimistic about things like the Paris Agreement, even things like lockdown. Is that going to give us the stabilization? And you can see with the black line that some months you think, oh, well, maybe it's leveling out, and then it carries on going up, and we're continuing to increase. So the glasses of champagne on there are because when we get that stable black line, that flattening of the line, we'll either be having champagne to celebrate the fact that we've actually limited climate change to something which is more manageable, or we'll need to drink probably a whole crate of champagne to drown our sorrows. So that's why that's in there. The other graph, I think this is the last one, and I apologise for these, but I just wanted to show you what the impact of that extra carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere. So we've got this big increase in carbon dioxide, about a 50% increase in how much is in the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution, and that's driven warming. So this is the global average. So if you're high latitudes, things like the Arctic, you've seen many degrees increase, but this is for the global average, and across the whole world we've seen over 1 degree Celsius of temperature increase, and that's already having serious negative impacts. And as I'm sure all of you are aware, because COP26 was focused on that, the big challenge now is limiting that further warming to below 2 degrees and ideally keeping it to 1.5. So we've got hardly any room left. We're already at about 1.2 degrees of warming in terms of that global average. And that average hides some really big extremes globally. So those two graphs for me are kind of the essence of where we're at and where we need to go in terms of flattening those curves. Right, so in terms of impacts of climate change, like I say, some of them are already occurring. We're seeing much higher temperatures. So the picture on the top left is the Science Centre in Glasgow, which was host to the Green Zone as part of COP26, but thankfully in November, so we didn't have a melting roof. But that is the roof melting when we had a really hot summer a couple of years back. And high temperatures are a real risk already for many millions of people around the world, particularly those who haven't got anywhere to cool off, where they're exposed to high temperatures and there isn't air conditioning, there isn't kind of protection, particularly the young and the elderly. And heat is becoming a risk here in the UK and in Scotland. It seems amazing at the moment, given what the weather is like outside. But that's one of the kind of nailed on aspects of climate change is this warming globally, but the extremes of temperature also getting more extreme. The other big one, this is a really long-term impact that we're already seeing the kind of downsides of, but this will be something with us throughout this century, with the kids we're teaching throughout their lives and for centuries to come, which is sea level rise. So as we warm the planet up, then the water in the oceans, that expands as well. So we've had some sea level rise from just the oceans getting warmer. What we're seeing now, though, is that's accelerating because more of the ice is melting, particularly the ice cap in Greenland and glaciers around the world, and the West Antarctic ice sheet, so down in Antarctica, that's also reducing in terms of losing water into the oceans. And they're so big that they're contributing more and more rapid rise in sea level. So we're expecting somewhere around 0.5 metre, maybe as much as 1 metre of sea level rise globally during this century. And if we look over the coming centuries, we're looking at multi-metre increases if we don't really limit those graphs I showed you, those temperature and CO2 graphs. So really the stakes are massive, not just for our generations alive today and those born in the next few decades, but actually for centuries to come. Sea level rise is one of those huge multi-generational risks for climate change. And the final picture on the slide is about rain, really. It's about the fact that as climate change intensifies, as the planet warms up, what we tend to get as a trend is if you're in a wet place, it will get wetter, and if you're in a dry place, it will get drier. And so that exacerbates flooding, obviously, but also drought. What we see in terms of our seasons in Scotland is we get our winters get wetter, but our summers get drier, and that makes it really hard, obviously, if you're a farmer, for instance, to make sure you're matching what you're growing with that changing water supply. And obviously it threatens both water supply and food supply for millions of people around the world, particularly those who are already in arid areas and really struggling to get enough water for things like irrigation for their crops. So I talked about some of these kind of impacts, and you can see on the top left, that was from a flooding incident a couple of years back. We've seen them in the past here in Scotland and in the UK and around the world. We'll see them more often, and that's partly because we've got the sea level rise. So if you're near the coast, it's more likely that the sea defences will be broken and you get flooding there. But it's also because of this more intense rainfall we're going to get. So when we get a rain shower or thunderstorm, because the atmosphere is warmer, it can hold more moisture. And so we get these really intense downpours, which can cause more and more flash flooding. So that's a real ongoing risk, particularly for us in Scotland and actually for our schools. If we look at where some of those are, they're in these risk areas. And so adapting to climate change that's locked in is going to be a key element of that. I mentioned heat. So that middle picture is from Delhi last year with a heat wave there where it got into the 50s Celsius. And one of the key issues is not just that high temperature, and they're getting even more extreme, but also, like I said, the infrastructure, the capacity to protect the most vulnerable. And the final picture on the bottom there is from a hurricane. So with hurricanes and storms, we often see them linked to climate change. It's pretty much impossible to link one storm or hurricane and say, oh, that's due to climate change. But what we do know, there's evidence that the most extreme, the most powerful hurricanes, category 4 and 5, they get more likely because of the warming that we're seeing, particularly oceanic warming around the world. And also when they dump their rainfall, there's much more rain, much more water up there to dump as well because of the warming atmosphere. Some of the other impacts just quickly. So this all sounds a bit bleak, isn't it? But I'm going to get onto some of the solutions in a minute. So wildfires, obviously, if we've got areas drying out much more and we've got higher temperatures, that's a real lethal combination in terms of wildfires. And again, this is a risk that we're seeing already very much in the US, in Australia and other parts of the world, but we'll see this risk increasing in Scotland too. Drought, the middle one there, and pest and disease attacks. Again, they're real risks for our food supplies and obviously our health through that and food prices. And that horrible thing down at the bottom right, that's a mosquito. One of the things we know with climate change is we're getting these changes in rainfall, we're getting changes in temperature, that some of the pests and diseases which already affect us, their ranges will change. So we know for mosquitoes that as it warms up, their range will change. There are things like there's a thing called blue tongue, which is carried by a midge that is in Europe, and it's come into the UK a few times. It's a real threat to our livestock farmers. Again, climate change is set to drive changes in that distribution, which might affect us and might threaten farmers here in Scotland in terms of this disease coming in. So let's talk some positives on responses. So we've got, that was the Paris Agreement, the top left. So that's Christiana and colleagues celebrating the Paris Climate Agreement back in 2015. An historic agreement from nations in terms of, yes, we need to tackle this and having that target of limiting warming to 2 degrees with an ambition of limiting it to 1.5. For Scotland in the middle there, we have an awful lot of climate policy, loads of engagement right across all the political parties, and all of you obviously are on this call, are interested in it. We know that it's a really big deal for us in Scotland. It's what our kids want to know about as well, but it is going to define all of our futures. So it is crucial, and we've got so much good stuff going on. The bottom picture is an example of that, in that we're kind of ahead of the global curve. If we look at what schools do down south, but overseas as well, the climate change awareness here in Scotland is much higher, and in our teaching, in our curriculum, it's more overt. But also, most of us will be aware, certainly in my university, for instance, that it's still not at a level that it needs to be. We need to deal, obviously, with things like climate anxiety. So those first pictures probably gave you climate anxiety, and actually talk about, yes, that reality, but what we can do about it, about the responses. And that's a real positive narrative, I think, for Scotland to the world. And one of the things we saw at COP26 was nations kind of taking note of that. So on those solutions, we have adaptation, which is really about responding to these impacts of climate change. And so the bridge at the top left, that's in Canada, that's an example of pre-adaptation. So that's kind of adaptation planning, where they said, right, we're building a bridge that we want to last for 100 years. And in 100 years, we might get a metre of sea level rise. So they built the bridge a metre higher, so that ships could go underneath, even if the sea level was a metre higher. So really good climate adaptation in terms of long planning and infrastructure. And we're seeing more and more of that. The middle picture is more familiar to a lot of us, I guess. And that's basically a sustainable urban drainage system, a SUDS, for a village where there's a real flood risk, particularly those flash floods, those really heavy downpours, so that when you get all that rainfall, there's somewhere for the water to go, so the houses don't get flooded. And the bottom right is my daughter, who's now 21, and hates me using that picture. That's Maddie. But that is her adapting to a summer holiday on the west coast of Scotland, and kind of sums up what adaptation is, which is it can be reactive in terms of what Maddie's doing there. It was raining, and so she's got her wellies on and she's adapting to her environment. But for a lot of climate change, we can see where we're headed in terms of rainfall and temperature, and so we can get ahead of the curve on that, like the bridge has done, and so protect people, protect economies, protect natural ecosystems as well. On mitigation, which is the other side of the coin, so we have to adapt more the less we cut emissions, which is mitigation. The more warming we get, the more adaptation. The more mitigation we do, so that's about making sure we level off the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere as early as possible. Then we have to adapt less. So it's much more expensive to adapt than mitigate. So that's where a lot of the emphasis is, but we obviously need to do both, because climate change is already happening. And all of you will be familiar with, I'm sure, all of these, but just to flag up some of the key areas of mitigation. So the guy in the top left is a coal worker, and that's one of the key things we've already seen. In Scotland, we don't have coal power anymore. In the UK, it's being phased out. So we need that globally, move away from fossil fuels. The big question there is, can we do that in a fair way, so that folk who are working, particularly in oil and gas in the northeast of Scotland, is a good example, that their skills aren't lost, that their livelihoods aren't lost, but actually they support the transition for our energy sector to zero emissions. We've got electric cars in the middle, so we need to decarbonise our transport system, and that's coupled with active travel, so walking and cycling and public transport are all part of mitigation in that sector. The building on the top right there, that's a heat map showing how much heat is escaping from a building, and that's one of the big challenges for us in Scotland is reducing the kind of heating demand for our houses and our offices and our schools, so that we can reduce how much carbon is being emitted in terms of heating them. The bottom three, so we've got an iPhone, because a lot of the carbon which is produced, and it's often, China is often singled out as saying, oh, they produce loads of carbon dioxide and they've got all these coal-fired power stations, but they aren't doing that for fun. They're doing it, yes, for their own economy and their own people, but they're doing it also to make loads of the stuff we consume. So actually there's a real role there for a more circular economy, for reusing and repairing things, reducing consumption levels. Related to that, the food, the plate of food there, so the food system contributes a large amount of greenhouse gas, nearly a quarter of emissions globally across the whole food system. And a key part of that is avoiding food waste, and also looking at how farmers can be part of the solution in terms of lower carbon production, tree planting, and that slide, that picture on the bottom right, which is about peatland restoration. That's a huge thing here in Scotland, where we've drained a lot of our peatlands. These are carbon-rich soils, and we've drained them for food production in the past. And now we've realised actually that's emitting a huge amount of carbon. It's damaged biodiversity. And actually, if we can restore them, wet them up again, block those drains like that guy standing over, then actually that will help limit the emissions and turn them into sinks for carbon. So they will take up carbon dioxide, but also restore their biodiversity and their resilience in terms of the help us stop flash flooding as well. So what now? I'll finish up. So the context is, obviously we're still in a pandemic, and one of the real dangers also with what's happening in Ukraine as well is that we take our eye off the ball in terms of climate change. Climate change during COVID has not gone away. It's still intensifying. Emissions went down by about 7% in terms of carbon emissions globally during the lockdowns, and then they've rebounded straight back up. So we don't want more lockdowns, but they didn't help us in terms of flattening that curve of CO2 and actually tackling climate change either. So we really need the recovery from COVID around the world and here in Scotland to be a green one that aligns with our move to net zero, as it's called, where we get to a stage where every ton of carbon we emit, we're sequestering or taking up that same ton by other means. The global climate, like I say, is still heading in definitely the wrong direction. We've got very little headroom in terms of the Paris climate goals. COP26 helped a fair bit. It was brilliant in terms of what Glasgow did, and as a showcase for Scotland. There were some good words, as Greta Thunberg would say, though. There was a lot of blah, blah, blah. And really, time is running out in terms of all the nations making that commitment to move away from coal. They really need to kind of walk the talk on that. Here in Scotland as well, we've got lots of policies, we've got lots of targets for how to do this, but actually we can't just talk about it anymore. It is about the action. And looking forward to COP27, which is going to be in Egypt, the big focus there is going to be less about, okay, let's set more targets, and more about the action, and also about the fact that climate change is already devastating lives, it's devastating ecosystems, putting people at risk. And so that adaptation part of it, how do we actually say, yeah, we need to actually protect people from sea level rise, from heat, from pests, from wildfire, and do that as Scotland, helping other countries around the world as part of our responsibility for historic emissions and as part of our leadership on climate change. So Net Zero Scotland, which I put here, that term is kind of crucial, because we've got a target to get to net zero by 2045. And that means all the mitigation we can possibly do, so cutting emissions as low as possible, with any that are left, and there will be some from agriculture, from the health sector, that we balance those with extra tree planting, with a thing called carbon capture and storage, so that we get to net zero. And we need to do that in a way which is resilient to the impacts of climate change, and just in terms of protecting people's livelihoods, like I say, right across Scotland. Crucial to all this, I am biased, but hopefully you share the bias, is going to be education and the skills of our existing workforce in terms of those oil and gas workers, helping with renewables expansion and increase, but the education of them and of all the kids that we work with and the students right now, in terms of aligning what they know and what their passions and interests are with the reality of living with and in climate change. Thanks, everyone. I'll now share my screen as well.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Dave. Before we move on, has anyone got any questions for Dave? If not, he is going to stick around to the end, so we can pop them in the chat, and if they come up, he can either answer them there or we can answer them at the end. Because I've just appeared for you all, I'll introduce myself. Conor introduced me earlier, but my name's Eve, and I'm one of the Senior Learning Officers here at Dynamic Earth. I'm going to share my screen so that I can talk to you a little bit about about what we do here at Dynamic Earth to talk about climate change, to teach kids about climate change. So what I'm going to be doing is introducing you to a few ways we approach climate change, talk about the key learning outcomes that we think we're achieving with these, and how we approach this at each learning level. So I'll go through each level in turn, so don't worry if I'm not touching on your level right now, I will get to it. And then I'll talk a bit about how you can use the approach we use in your own classrooms. So to start us off, let's think about early and first level. So with all our early and first level workshops, what we do is usually focus on a storytelling model. So we think about how we can teach any lessons that we want to teach through storytelling. So you can see with our climate change workshop, the two kind of learning outcomes we're really focusing on here are I can talk about science stories to develop my understanding of science and the world around me, and I have contributed to discussions of current climate news items to help develop my awareness of climate science. So both of these outcomes, they don't specifically talk about climate change, but climate change is a really good topic to use if you want to discuss, if you want to hit these outcomes. So it's a really good way to do that. The way we do it in our climate workshop, which is called Puffin Detectives, a climate mystery, is we use the story of two puffins living on the Isle of May here in Scotland, and they're waiting for their breakfast and it's taking a really long time, and they go off on an adventure around the island to talk to all the different animals to try and find out what's changing on the Isle of May, which is making it harder for their mum to catch their breakfast. And through this, the kids take part in lots of interactive activities. They do lots of things, they listen to the story, and they connect with that story of climate change and how it's affecting these puffins. So we're telling that story of climate change through a story about puffins. So hopefully by engaging in the story, they're engaging with that science. And so storytelling is a really powerful tool that you can use with this age group. The way we do storytelling at Dynamic Earth is we tell the story sort of freehand. We just tell it without a book or anything like that, but there's plenty of books that you can use as well. So I have a few examples up here. You can see on the left, that's a picture of some of the props from our workshops. So we've got puppets that they use. You can see some fish. Those little bowls are the rock pools that they feel to see if the rock pools are getting warmer or not. And so they're really doing scientific investigation and touching real things to discover climate change for themselves. We're not just telling them, hey, this is a thing. We're letting them discover that and learn about the effects through the story. I've put a few examples of books on that slide as well. There are many, many others, but you don't have to come up with a story yourself. There are many stories that will tell these stories of climate change and help you have these discussions with your pupils. So that's first level, early and first level. Moving up, if we go to second and third level, we have our climate change fundamentals workshop. So we mostly deliver this to second level and third level students who don't have a lot of background or information on climate science already. And this is a real introduction to what climate change is. What's the science of climate change? How does it work? So this is where we're getting into learning outcomes that specifically focus on climate change. So at second level, it's I can discuss the environmental impact of human activity, suggest ways in which we can live in more sustainable and environmentally responsible ways. And at third level, we're trying to aim to, I can explain some of the processes which contribute to climate change and discuss the possible impact of atmospheric change on the survival of living things. The way our workshop is structured is the pupils take part in several investigations in little groups, and then they report back to the class what they have discovered. So not only are they doing this learning where they're discovering it for themselves, but they're also learning how to take that information and share it with their peers, explain what they have discovered. So there's some really good things that happen when you do learning like this. So we find it's really effective because there's a lot of hands-on activities. So here's some of the props that we use from our workshops. So the stuff on the right-hand side there are some fish and some plankton and the very edge of the boat. And basically they build a food web. So food webs are something that you probably are doing with your learners anyway, but by using physical props and placing physical props into their food web, it just gives them a little bit more sort of tactile engagement and a bit more excitement. There's some things for them to interact with. And then our jigsaw puzzle as well, and they've got a few jigsaw puzzles they put together to find out what the impacts are on the UK. We focus really closely on UK impacts in this workshop because we want to instill the idea that climate change is affecting us here in the UK and Scotland, as well as around the world, because the narrative is often about polar bears and ice caps and things like that. So really focus on how it's affecting their everyday lives. What's really nice about these kind of investigations is you can really link in a lot of other skills, things like ICT, maths by looking at graphs, literacy by discussions and assimilating information and resharing it. And then at the end of our workshop, we do a game called Science or Fiction, which I believe my colleague Chris will talk to you a bit about later. But it's a fun game where they get a little bit competitive to think about different ways in which we can tackle climate change. And so by making it a little bit competitive, a little bit fun, you're engaging them in another way again. So it's sort of just another way of kind of pulling learners in, keeping their attention and keeping them engaged in this topic. So moving up, we have our 4th level and senior phase workshops. So we call these workshops climate change in context, and we have a few different workshops that we offer here. But these are the learning outcomes that we think we're hitting with them. So it's I can discuss the sustainability of a key natural resource and analyse the possible implications for human activity. And I can develop my understanding of the interaction between humans and the environment by describing and assessing the impacts of human activity on an area. So here, really what we're trying to do with climate change is take the climate change knowledge that they have and apply it to real-world applications. Think about how humans and the environment are interacting and what that really means. So like I said, we have a few workshops that cover this. These are Glaciers and Our Climate, which basically looks at landform and how glaciers form our lands, but then also what the impact of climate change is on those glaciers and how glaciers have helped us learn about climate change. So there's a lovely kind of circular message in that workshop. We've also got Energy for the Future, which, as you imagine, is about our energy demand and how we're going to get it in the future. Like Dave mentioned, we're still burning coal here in the UK, and that's something that we're really going to have to look at for meeting our future energy demands if we want to tackle climate change. And then the last one is pretty topical, it's climate justice. So this is looking at the kind of geopolitical context of climate change. How does it really affect people, and how is it affecting people differently around the world? So what we're trying to do in these workshops is take these practical and case study type workshops and show them how they can apply their knowledge of climate change to real world issues. So these can be really fun. They can do a lot of ICT stuff. So you can see a Google map of a glacier there. So in that activity, what they're doing is looking at historical Google images to track glacial retreat. And they do some actual chemical testing of samples and things like that to try and find out what's happening in different places. And so by using these real life examples, we really contextualize the importance of learning about climate change and contextualize the importance of studying these subjects. So it really puts relevance into it and helps explain why we want them to learn about it at all. It also hopefully gives them some ideas of how to start solving climate change. Learners at this age are probably quite concerned about climate change. They probably know quite a lot about it, and they want to know what they can do and how their education fits into that. So that's kind of what we're trying to tap into. But one more thing I want to talk about, which is something we offer at all levels, and that is our outdoor learning programs. Outdoor learning is a brilliant way to talk about climate change because you're out in nature, and nature and the environment and biodiversity is what is really affected by climate change. So by immersing students in that, you can really get them to connect to that and care about that. And if they care about nature and the world around them, then they'll care about climate change and they'll want to learn these things. We have a couple of workshops that I think really, really closely align with climate change, though a lot of our outdoor workshops do. So that is air quality investigators that we offer for 2nd level, and our field skills focus on microclimates that we do for 4th level and senior phase pupils. So they're really highly practical, which is a lovely thing about outdoor learning. Pupils will be out actually measuring things, actually doing things, taking measurements that they can then use, collecting data that they can process and compare to data collected around the world. In air quality investigators, they look at really small things. They look at lichens on trees, which are these tiny symbiotic organisms that are a fungus and an algae living together, and they can look at them pretty much anywhere and think about how they're an indicator species, what they tell us about the air quality. In microclimates, we're looking at more traditional things that you consider with climate change. You're looking at weather, basically. But you're looking at how a small-scale thing, like building a building in the middle of a playing field, how that is affecting the climate. And so then you can contextualize that into climate change in general as, well, if one building has this effect on the wind speed and the temperature and things like that, what is a human's effect on the whole planet? What is our effect in cities, in countries? How is this changing things? So outdoor learning, I know, can feel difficult to do when you're stuck in school, but a lot of this learning can happen in your playgrounds. There's loads of stuff you can do on biodiversity in your playground, on air temperature, on air quality, looking at cloud cover, looking at litter and pollution. So there's lots and lots of options there. And there's also lots of options for getting involved with citizen science projects, especially if you have a bit more time with learners than we do. Things like the Opal projects or the Globe projects, you can really tie into and do long-term measurements of things in your school playground. And things like the Globe projects link up with NASA, and you can sort of collect data that's helping to double-check NASA satellites. And by collecting this data that's a much bigger part of a bigger scientific study, students get to actually contribute to the scientific understanding of climate change. And so then they'll really buy into learning about it because they want to do it right. They want to help contribute to the scientific understanding. So just a few things that are really good for using outdoor learning for. So next, I wanted to really briefly touch on learning for sustainability. So like most schools in Scotland, we are trying to integrate learning for sustainability into all of our learning, and we do that pretty well. You can see I've got a box here with 1 million different hashtags from the learning for sustainability hashtags, and you can see in just those few workshops that I mentioned, these are all the hashtags that we touch on in that. So there's lots and lots of different ones. Some of them obviously are fairly obvious. Tackling climate change is a big one there. But a lot of things about equality and fairness, about how we're using our resources, about sustainable development, about outdoor learning, about protecting biodiversity. So there's lots of different parts of this learning for sustainability model that you can touch on and engage your learners with. All right, I just have one more thing that I would like to cover, and that is a few things to watch out for. So talking about climate change is really important. We want our learners to understand about climate change because it's a huge issue affecting our planet. Unfortunately, there can be some issues that you can hit with this. There can be some things that affect you. So one of these is eco-anxiety. So eco-anxiety is pretty common in pupils nowadays, and pupils as young as like 7 or 8 have self-reported having eco-anxiety. And eco-anxiety is basically just any negative feelings students have about climate change. Because there's a lot of negative press about it and because there's a lot of worrying things to be said about it, sometimes students can get very upset or worried about climate change. So the way to avoid this is being wary of being too doom and gloom. And I'm not saying don't talk about the impacts. Impacts are super important, but make sure that you're balancing this with positive progress that we're making, with good examples of things that we're doing and things that they can do themselves to help fight climate change. How can they get involved? And moving on to the next one, which is personal versus corporate responsibility. Because sometimes when we're trying to prevent that eco-anxiety, we can focus a lot on personal action, and personal action can be great. So this can be things like switching off the lights, turning off the taps, recycling, walking to school, all great personal actions that pupils can do. However, if we focus too heavily on that, we can end up making them feel like climate change is their responsibility. They have to fix it and they have to do it now. And there's lots that pupils that we work with can't affect. So they can't affect what kind of car their parents drive. They can't affect where they shop and what they buy. They can't affect what corporations do as well. Governments and corporations have a huge part to play in fighting this climate change problem. So we don't want students to go away with the idea that they're personally responsible for this, because that can actually feed into that eco-anxiety again. And we end up back with the problem we had at the start. Something you can do for this is to make sure that they're aware of this corporate responsibility, and you can get students involved in things like writing to MPs and lobbying, doing community events, lobbying government, lobbying organisations that your school works with, asking places to stand up and take a stand in this climate change thing, take action to help. So just keeping to think about that wider responsibility is important. The next thing I wanted to touch on was climate justice. So I mentioned this with our climate justice workshop. It's important to really think about climate change on a global scale and make sure we're thinking about it fairly. And Dave talked about this as well, that there's a lot of sort of rhetoric about like, oh, China's got lots of emissions, and it's a more complicated problem than that. So it's just being careful in the way that you're talking about climate change, that you're maybe not playing into these stereotypes, because there's lots of different ways to talk about climate change and no one country is to blame more than any other. So it's making sure that you're thinking fairly about that, and the impacts and the ability of certain countries to sort of start climate mitigation things can be very different. That can also be true on a local scale. If we think about here in the UK, sometimes doing things that are good for the climate can be quite expensive. So electric cars are more expensive than petrol or diesel ones. Some people can't afford to buy an electric car, and we should make sure we're not making our pupils feel guilty for not being able to do that. So making sure that we're just contextualizing it from a justice point of view as well. So my final point, which I really touched on, is how to kind of mitigate all of this, is to think about empowerment. You want to make sure that your pupils feel enabled to fight climate change. You want them to feel like they've got power in this situation. You want to make them feel like they can change this without feeling crushed by the responsibility of that. So that's sort of my rough outline of pitfalls, and that's all I have to say for you guys. So that was my quick introduction of the way we embed climate change into our learning experiences, and a few of the different things that you can do to do that, and a few things to avoid as well. So unless there's any questions, what I'll do now is I'll hand over to my colleague Chris, who will take you through some of the activities that you can take from us and use yourself in your classrooms. So I'll hand you over to Chris.
Okay, seamless transition. Hello, everyone. I will just stop sharing Eve's presentation and I'll move that over to my own. And we might just adjust the camera height because we don't have a consistent height across the team, sadly. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see the slides just there. I'll look at the actual camera. Hello. So as Eve says, my name is Chris. I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the activities that we do in the workshops that we deliver, and also in some of the public engagement activities that we deliver in the holidays, as well as for science festivals and that kind of thing, which are also appropriate for doing with your class if you've got the time and the resources. So I will split it into 3 different types of activity. And they all incorporate learning for sustainability in some kind of way. So the first one that I'll talk about is printable activities. So start off quite straightforward, and hopefully these are all activities which you should be able to do with resources that you have at school already. So it just involves printing stuff out, maybe cutting stuff, matching them, joining them together, sticking stuff, but all very basic stationery. So that should be super, super cheap to do and super straightforward to do. Then I'll go slightly more complicated with some hands-on activities, but these should all be super cheap hands-on activities. So they should all use resources that you can buy in a local shop, and they are very, very cheap. So hopefully they will not strain any school budgets too much. And they'll be quite straightforward to understand and incorporate into lessons. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about learning pathways. So that is our name for lesson plans that our team have put together. So across our learning and engagement team, we have different learning pathways that cover a range of different topics. So the one that I'll touch on is our climate change and COP26 learning pathway, but we've got a range that look at outdoor learning, that look at nature-based solutions, that look at volcanoes, a range of different things that we teach in other workshops that we do at Dynamic Earth. So if you're interested in any of those, you can also learn a little bit more about them. So I'll start off with our printable activities. So as I say, all of these are activities that should take minimal time for you to prepare because they're pretty much ready for you to go if you just print them out. Now, all of these resources are available on Dynamic Earth Online. So that is a big bank of resources that our team have put together on dynamicearthonline.co.uk, and it's all split by subject. So if you're looking for a particular theme that you want to cover in your class, you can have a look at the resources we've got up there. I'm going to talk about 4 examples, which is barely scratching the surface, but it'll give you an idea for the kind of thing that we've got available for you to use. So the first one is source or sink, and the second one is science or fiction. Eve mentioned science or fiction earlier. These are both activities that we do in our climate change workshop for upper primary and lower secondary. They are, they've gamified essentially activities to help kids learn about climate change. Then we've got our rainforest bingo activity, which is adapted from our rainforest workshops. And we've got a couple of those for different ages. And we've got our food webs activity. And so again, Eve talked about food webs that we talk about in our climate change workshop. So I'll talk a little bit about how we've adapted that to make an activity that you can use at home or in your classrooms as well. So Source or sink, first of all, is quite a straightforward activity. It's basically introducing pupils to the idea that we can be sources of emissions or that we can be sinks of emissions. So you can see in the picture on the slide there that we've got stuff like transport, buildings, factories. Those are examples of sources. So getting your pupils to think about different ways that emissions are actually produced and what we mean by emissions. So they might have heard of carbon dioxide and methane, but this is an opportunity to talk about how those are produced by burning fossil fuels, or in the case of our cows, how methane might be produced because of big agricultural businesses, particularly massive expansive farms in places like the USA and Brazil. So it's an opportunity to try and demystify what carbon dioxide and methane are and why they are a problem. And then sink is something like forests or the ocean, something that is absorbing some of those emissions. So an opportunity to talk about how forests and the ocean are particularly important environments to protect, and because they absorb the emissions that we're producing, and how the balance is a little bit out of sync. Right in the center, we've got humans. And that's a really important topic because, as Eve was talking about, and we are all about empowerment, we're all about solutions. Dave was talking about that as well. We want to make sure there are conversations about what humans are doing to tackle the problem. So it's a good opportunity to talk about where the emissions are coming from and how we can tackle that issue. And linked to that, and indeed, as I say, we do it in the same workshop, is science or fiction. So you don't need to read all the details on that slide, but that's just a little excerpt from an answer. Basically, in this resource, we've got a selection of different ideas, and they are either totally true science or they are totally fake fiction. And we present these ideas to pupils in the classroom, and they have to identify whether we've made them up or whether it's real scientific research that's taking place. So it's introducing that idea of climate innovation, some of the research that's going on around the world, and that pupils are that pupils can learn about, and that scientists are actually researching. And there are some niche things like kite power that is potentially quite a small scale project. And then we've got bigger things like geothermal energy, which is something that your pupils might have heard of before, but it's an opportunity to talk about how some of that works, and bring in broader topics like energy use and power, which might relate into some of the other topics that you're talking about in your classroom. So it's quite a simple activity. It's just different squares that you can print out, and then you can flip them over and see if they are true or false. And as Eve says, it can bring a nice competitive element if that works for your class. See who can score nice and high. And hopefully give your pupils a little bit of hope for the future that there are a few different solutions we can try. Then we've got our rainforest bingo. Bingo activities are a popular one here because we can apply them to a lot of different topics and a lot of different activities. So particularly when we're outdoors, for example, there was a photo that Eve showed you of some kids holding up a wildflower bingo sheet. So when we are out and about in Holyrood Park, we're really lucky to have that outdoor space. There are lots of wildflowers there. It means that pupils can have a look and see what's growing out there. But the bingo activity can be adapted in a lot of different ways, and it's great because it's really straightforward and really resource light. So in the context of our rainforest workshop, we don't play bingo in the workshop. We have a little rainforest shop that pupils can shop at online. But this is an adapted version where you have to identify if there is palm oil in different ingredient lists and stuff around about the house, or maybe stuff that you look at in the shops. And it's quite a straightforward activity, but it means that you can bring in deeper conversations depending on the level of your learners. So for example, when talking about palm oil, you can talk about how biodiversity is great and diversity in forests and in different environments is great, but monocultures maybe not so good. So if you're just growing one kind of plant to produce palm oil, then maybe that's not so good for the environment. But you can go into more depth with more advanced advanced learners. So you can talk about sustainability more generally. You can talk about the complexities of using palm oil in lots of different products and the effects that can have on the economy, that can have on people living in different parts of the world who rely on it. And also, as Eve was talking about as well, affordability. So a lot of the time we've got these solutions that we can't necessarily afford to buy or afford to use. So it's a really nice way to get started in that topic of sustainability quite broadly, which is obviously great for learning for sustainability. And lastly, it's our food webs activity. So here are 4 examples of some species, some organisms that you might find across Scotland. We've got a resource which has loads and loads of different Scottish animals. And the idea is that you just print it out, you can cut them out and just use string to connect them. So you can see how all of these different creatures, all of these different organisms are connected. I've just got a simple 4 here, so this is not a particularly complicated food web, but it's a nice way to look at how species interact in environments in Scotland. And with the effects of climate change, you can potentially make some changes to those ecosystems. So you can get your pupils to think about what might happen to some of the species if they experience different changes in the weather systems. So if you lost red squirrels completely, for example, which is obviously a concern, what impact is that going to have on different parts of the ecosystem? So you can relate that back to Scotland, and it's a really nice way to get them thinking about the impact that climate change can have on our environment in quite a direct kind of a way. So, as I say, these are all on Dynamic Earth Online, and there's a search function, so you can search for any of these 4 terms and they should come up. Next up, we've got our hands-on activities. So as I say, these are activities which might require slightly more materials, but they are all deliberately cheap, affordable activities that you should hopefully be able to consider even on a tight budget. And again, these are all activities that are based on activities that we deliver in our school workshops or that we do in public engagement activities for our public program and holidays or science festivals or other events like that. So we have got our tornado tubes, we have got stop motion films, we've got blubber gloves, and we have got eco bricks. So first up, our tornado tubes. This is a picture of one that you can make at home. This is the picture from Dynamic Earth Online. It's just using a bottle with some water, food coloring, and some herbs in it. And the idea is that you can spin it, you can see how the water is moving, and it gives you an idea for how a tornado or how a whirlpool would behave to link into conversations about extreme weather events. Now, I've got a tornado tube that we use in the classroom, so I might dip off. Oh no, I'm still on camera. This one uses 2 bottles, and the idea is that you just spin it round and then shake it, and then you get the whirlpool forming inside the bottle. It's got some glitter in it rather than some herbs. I don't know if you can see that clearly from the glare of the light, but the glitter will show the pattern of the tornado moving around. And that helps us talk about how tornadoes can be particularly damaging and link that into discussions about extreme weather events that we are seeing across the world because of climate change. Now, the picture that we've got up there uses herbs rather than glitter because we're trying to move away from all these little microplastics. These are quite old tornado tubes, the ones we make in the future will probably not use lots and lots of little bits of glitter, but it should work the same. You should be able to see the same effect using those materials. So it's an old favorite here. As I say, those are quite old bits of kit, but we still use them very, very regularly because they work really well. Then next up, we've got the idea of stop motion films. So you can see on the screen here, we've just got a list of the materials that you will need. It's very straightforward. And this is from a rewilding activity that we've got available for you to use. And the nice thing about the stop motion activity is that if you've got a tablet or you've got a phone that you can download the app onto, it's completely free to use. So it's a really nice way of including digital skills into your education. So when we're talking about rewilding, we talk about how, again, food webs in Scotland might be affected, or different environments across Scotland might be affected. So there are lots of conversations in the news, for example, about introducing beavers or wolves or lynx. And so we've used it in that context to have different cutout pictures of these different species, put them into an environment, and then add more or take more away depending on the predator-prey interactions. If you've got tablets or phones that you can use at school, it's a really nice way to use this digital skill in a variety of different ways and not actually having to spend any more money if you've already got that kit. So that's a really popular one for us. We use it in our kids' science club on the weekends, and we've also used it for science festivals as well when talking about satellite imagery and how satellites look at environments and how they can record environmental change. So depending on what topic you want to talk about, that's a really nice activity to use. And then we've got our blubber gloves. And we've got a picture here, which is from Sick Science, so not from us, but this is an activity that we've used. And I've used it at Dynamic Earth with visiting families. So we do have some links to external sites that we've tried and tested. If there's any external resources on Dynamic Earth online, you can rest assured we have tried it and it does actually work. The nice thing about blubber gloves is that it's great for talking about animal adaptations. So when we have been talking about polar regions and polar animals adaptations, it's a really nice activity to try. You just need a couple of sandwich bags. You can get some like vegetable suet, something like Trex, put it into one of the sandwich bags, put another sandwich bag on top of that so that the suet or the fat is in between the bags, and then gaff tape that together. And then you put your hand in so it's like a glove. And then that suet will protect your hand from any icy temperatures. So you can get kids to try and stick their hand into icy water and see how long they'll do it for, and then try it with the blubber glove on and see if they can feel the cold temperatures at all. It's a really immediate, direct way for them to see that a lot of polar animals have this blubber that protects them from these extreme temperatures. And I know that extreme environments and environments different from Scotland's environments are a popular topic and one that you cover in the curriculum. So this is a nice way of demonstrating an adaptation that a lot of polar animals have. And that can link on to conversations about how these environments are being affected by climate change. So obviously, we've all seen polar bears on the tiny little iceberg or a tiny little shelf of sea ice floating out in the water. When you're talking about animal adaptations and how these environments are affected, nice immediate demos like this we found really useful. And then lastly, we've got our eco bricks, which again, you might have heard of before. They're part of a wider campaign. I've got an example just here. So it's just a plastic bottle packed full of plastic. And this is an activity that we use quite a lot, actually. We used it in our summer club last year, where kids come for a few days and do lots of different outdoor activities. It's just packed full of waste plastic that can't be recycled. You can also use balloons and stuff, and you can use a wooden spoon or something similar and just push it down and compact it into a plastic bottle. The idea then is that you can use these as bricks to build different things. So a popular thing to do is to build them, you build things outside using them, such as planters or outdoor furniture, just packing them together using soil or clay or some other kind of thing, just to make them all stick. And rather than sending stuff to landfill or even sending stuff to the recycling, it's a way of keeping everything contained. It's a way of reusing and helps hammer home that point of reduce, reuse, recycle. And obviously, we want people to use less single-use plastic where they can, but it's a nice way of making sure we're not throwing it away and we're finding new uses for it. And so great for conversations like Dave was talking about at the start, about the circular economy and what we can do with stuff we can't recycle and why it's important to try and use less single-use stuff in the first place. So that's a whistle-stop tour of some of the hands-on activities that we can offer you as well. The last big thing I wanted to touch on was that learning pathway that I mentioned. So The example I'm going to talk about in particular is one which is about climate change and COP26. Obviously, COP26 has been a hot topic in Scotland because it was in Glasgow, but we're keen to keep it going as a conversation because obviously it does happen every year. So even though it's in Egypt this year, it's still relevant to the conversations around climate change. So we've got different levels to this learning pathway. So we've got 4 different stages in this particular one. And this one talks about what climate change is, essentially, the science behind climate change. We've got some of the effects of climate change. And then we come on to the idea of empowerment and the idea of what collective action might look like. So what the big group conversations are like in big events like COP26, when nations come together to discuss it. And then finally, the idea of individual action, because we don't want people to finish the topic feeling powerless. We want them to finish feeling like they can do something and that they are ready to try and do something. And so we want to give a few different options for what that might look like. So the idea is that this is a range of resources available on Dynamic Earth Online that are structured in such a way that it makes a coherent journey. So they know what the science of climate change is, they know what the effects are and why it's important, they know what groups are doing, they know what's going on to try and tackle it, and they know what they can do as well. When it comes to empowerment, the main thing that we can suggest is making sure that people are still talking about it, even if your pupils are quite young and they don't know how they can make a difference. As long as they keep talking about it, that's more likely to lead to more action. So that's one message that we're really keen to convey. And hopefully, by talking about the learning pathway, by talking about those printed activities and those hands-on activities, you can see how we're incorporating learning for sustainability in a range of things that we do. So we're talking about tackling climate change, and we're talking about responsible use of the planet's resources. We're incorporating a lot of contact with nature, either with outdoor learning or with activities that encourage people to think about the outdoors and their effects on them. We're thinking about waste reduction and recycling, and we're thinking about all sorts of critical thinking and what the impacts are of our actions and of actions of other people across the world. So that's a few of the learning for sustainability hashtags that we think we're covering, that we know we're covering. And hopefully that gives you an idea for how a straightforward activity that you do in the classroom can really easily bring in learning for sustainability into your lessons as well. So that brings me to the end. The last thing is just to reiterate that all of these things are on Dynamic Earth Online, so you can have a look at it, dynamicearthonline.co.uk, and have a look through and see if there are any activities or any topics that you think might be appropriate for your class. I know questions have been coming through, and I know my colleagues have been answering them as well. If you do have any more questions, feel free to put them on in the chat, and I will hand back over to Conor. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks very much, Chris. It's the last of our seamless transitions. I'll just take my mask off for you. So thank you very much to Chris and to Eve and to Dave for giving us their time this afternoon. We hope we've given you lots of examples of how you can embed learning for sustainability in the context of climate change with your learners at various levels across the curriculum. Before we leave you today, we just wanted to tell you about a few other ways that we can support you, because that's what we're all about. We're about supporting and empowering you to deliver learning with your learners all across Scotland. The first thing we want to share with you is our full school learning brochure, which tells you all about all of our indoor and outdoor workshops. Feel free to get in touch with either myself or one of our colleagues in our bookings department if you've got any questions about that. But there's loads of different ways you can get involved with indoor and outdoor experiences with the learning and engagement team at Dynamic Earth. The other thing we want to share with you is our online section of Dynamic Earth Online for educators, which has all of those learning pathways, all of our online workshop opportunities, and also every single experience you could possibly want to do with free CLPL, which has been supported by Education Scotland. So we've got 3 fantastic on-demand modules available online, which includes one focusing on UN Sustainable Goal Life on Land, and UN Sustainable Goal Life Below Water. We also have a fantastic online module focusing on creative science, which looks at how we can blend science and creativity together for interdisciplinary learning. The last thing to say for you today is that this is a pilot session. This is a pilot program for us. We've never delivered online CLPL before. So we'd be really grateful for your feedback on how the session today has gone. And I'll be emailing you all a link out to a short survey afterwards. And I'd be really grateful for about 5 minutes of your time to tell us how today has gone. Many of you we know are joining us for our Oceans CLPL section, which is next month. We look forward to welcoming you as part of that. And the last thing for me to say is just thank you so much for joining us today, and to stay up to date with everything about Dynamic Earth, please feel free to sign up to our school e-newsletter, and we'll share that link with you as well. Otherwise, thank you very much again to all of the team, to Professor Dave Reay from the University of Edinburgh, and also to all of you for joining us today. We hope you found this session really worthwhile, really useful, and we look forward to working with you and your learners in the future at Dynamic Earth. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.